We have long recognized the importance of setting aside special places in the ocean where nature can recover and flourish. In Palau, the traditional practice of bull involves placing reef areas off limits to fishing during known fish spawning and feeding periods. Scientists tell us we need to protect and conserve at least 30% of the global ocean by 2030 to restore biodiversity, protect habitats, and sustain the many services the ocean provides. Governments around the world are committing to this goal and must support community-led marine protection that will benefit both people and the ocean.
Just want to say thank you to National Geographic and all the photographers who've provided the amazing images we see here at the conference. Across the globe, 30 by 30 has become a rallying cry for the protection of nature and biodiversity. Scientists call for the conservation and protection of at least 30% of the land and ocean by 2030 to halt the accelerating loss of species and protect the ecosystems upon which our economic security depends. As parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity negotiate the next biodiversity framework that they will adopt later this year in Kunming, China, 94 nations have joined the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People in support of the 30 by 30 goal. Today, I am thrilled to announce that there is now number 95, as the United States is joining the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People. However, we all know we will not reach this enormous global target without equally ambitious action within our own national waters. As you heard from President Biden yesterday, he's committed the United States to conserve at least 30% of our ocean and land by 2030. As a further commitment, we would like to announce today the launch of the Ocean Conservation Pledge and invite other countries to commit to conserve at least 30% of their nation's waters. Conserving our coastal and ocean waters provides a triple bottom line of protecting biodiversity, conserving blue carbon, and restoring fisheries. Our challenge is now to move from ambition to action, and to do so in ways that benefit people and nature. I would now like to turn the program over to my US government colleague, Keone Nakoa, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Insular and International Affairs with the Department of Interior. Keone has long been an advocate for Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. Keone has brought together a range of viewpoints and voices on the importance of marine protected areas to people, nature, and climate. So please welcome Keone Nakoa.
Thank you so much, Assistant Secretary. Aloha, Ali, aloha mai kako. Welcome to the Marine Protected Areas panel of the Our Ocean Conference today. It's my pleasure to introduce to you the wonderful panelists that I just met a couple days ago, but already we seem like family. So let me start with Maya Delaney, the Youth Climate Ambassador, and for the Bahamas Associate of the Ocean Risk and Resilience Action Alliance. Melissa Garvey, Global Director for Ocean Protections at the Nature Conservancy. Stephen Victor, Minister of Agriculture, Fisheries, and the Environment of the Republic of Palau. Chairwoman Violet Sage Walker, Tribal Chair, Northern Chumash Tribal Council, and nominator for the proposed Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary, and Dwayne Fraser, Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority Board. Mahalo for joining us. Please have a seat. To start off, I'd like to thank our gracious hosts, the government of Palau, and Secretary Kerry for holding this great event. Earlier this year, I had the honor of signing a memorandum of understanding for the National Park Service of the United States to partner on sustainable service tourism with the Minister of Finance of Palau. This is just one example of the productive partnerships that I know are being created at this workshop, or at this conference, and sustained by the open dialogue between the many attendees here this year. As the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Insular and International Affairs, I also have the pleasure of overseeing the coordination of the Interior's Oceans, Coasts, and Great Lakes program. One of the issues that I work on with my Interior and interagency colleagues, some of which are in the audience today, is the conservation, restoration, and revitalization of the lands, waters, and wildlife upon which we all depend. In one of his first actions in office, President Biden issued a call to action that we work together to conserve, connect, and restore 30% of our lands and waters by 2030 for the sake of our economy, our health, and our well-being. This call to action sparked the launch of the America the Beautiful initiative. Paramount to this effort is a collaborative and inclusive approach to conservation, one that supports healthy communities, is locally led, honors tribal sovereignty, and supports the priorities of indigenous and island communities. I am proud of the Department of the Interior's lead role in this effort. In the United States, DOI is also responsible for managing our country's natural resources and cultural resources, as well as taking care of the government's trust responsibilities with US tribes, indigenous people, island territories, and of course, the freely associated states. DOI manages, protects, and provides access to 35,000 miles of coastline and around 900 million acres in over 275 protected areas. These areas are along coasts, marine ecosystems, and include wildlife refuges, national parks, and marine national monuments. As our panel will discuss later today, marine protected areas are an important management tool to conserve biodiversity, to sustain healthy fisheries, and safeguard ocean ecosystems, protect natural and cultural heritage, and of course address the climate crisis. Well-managed marine protected areas can provide invaluable ecosystem services, such as carbon sequestration and coastal protection, and of course resilience. There are also economic engines that support fishing, tourism, and recreation. One of the most important priorities for the Interior and for our country is expanding indigenous co-stewardship of our lands, waters, and resources. And the Biden-Harris administration is leading with science and traditional ecological knowledge, otherwise known as indigenous knowledge, to address the climate crisis. Over generations and generations, our indigenous communities observed their surroundings and not only developed indigenous knowledge, but also respected and maintained a balance with nature. While these are definitely cultural practices, make no mistake, this is distilled, time-tested, and reliable knowledge, and it is science. In my home state of Hawaii, the Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument is one of our premier examples of indigenous co-stewardship in the marine environment. Papahanaumokuakea is the largest contiguous and fully protected conservation area in the United States, and one of the largest marine conservation areas in the world, encompassing 1.5 million square kilometers. The area the monument protects has great cultural significance to my community, the Native Hawaiian community, and includes our creation and settlement stories, a connection to early shared Polynesian ancestry. Papahanaumokuakea is also used to practice millennia-old important activities like traditional, non-instrument, long-distance voyaging and wayfinding. And I thank our friends in Micronesia for allowing the gift of wayfinding to return back to my people. The gifts that were at some point lost, we owe a great debt of gratitude to Mau Pialag. The monument is part of the most remote island archipelago on Earth and supports dynamic reef ecosystems with more than 7,000 marine species, of which approximately 1/4 is unique to the Hawaiian Islands. And more importantly for this panel, Papahanaumokuakea is cooperatively managed to ensure ecological integrity and to achieve strong long-term protections and the perpetuation of the northwestern Hawaiian Islands and the ecosystem that thrives there. Native Hawaiian culture and heritage resources, and preserves these resources for current and future generations. 4 co-trustees, the U.S. Department of the Interior, U.S. Department of Commerce, the State of Hawaii, and the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, representing the Native Hawaiian community, protect this special place. Last year, the co-trustees of Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument released a historic guidance document, one called Mai Kapomai. This document helps the federal and state agencies further integrate Native Hawaiian culture, traditional knowledge, and management concepts into all areas of marine area management. It is my personal hope that this document, and more importantly, this process that was used to create this valuable document, can be a model and could provide greater co-stewardship for marine protected areas around the world. With all that said, everyone here knows the value that MPAs bring as we all seek to support and sustain our MPAs. The challenge we keep in mind is to return this investment, and as we consider how these investments in our resources will support these special areas. And with that said, we have an amazing panel today, and the first person up is Maya Delaney. I'm so sorry. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with you in Palau. I myself am from the Bahamas, so between the warmth and the water, it's actually been quite reminiscent of my own home country. And in fact, I was just home 2 weeks ago to visit Nana. She is my maternal grandmother, and she's lovingly known in her community as Miss Mabel. The island that she lives on is Great Harbor Key. It's in the northern Bahamas, and it's about 6 or 7 miles long, so quite small. But anybody who knows me well has heard me say 1,000 times over that Great Harbor Key is my favorite place on the face of the earth. And that's because in many ways, the natural environment remains untouched, and the biodiversity there is so rich. For example, on the southern end, there's a spot called Shark Creek, which is this network of mangroves that acts as a nursery for young marine life: green turtles, sharks, stingrays. And so I truly believe that Great Harbor Key is a striking illustration of the opportunity to further develop in harmony with that natural environment. Great Harbor Key has the opportunity to become a model for nature-based infrastructure solutions that enhance physical resilience. But Shark Creek, that critical breeding and spawning ground, is currently zoned for a hotel and a marina in the island's development plan, meaning that it is at risk of dredging and all of the general degradation that typically comes with heavy foot and vessel traffic. But understand that this challenge is not unique to us. This is one that many other small island developing states face. We have historically had to turn to traditional modes of development which rely disproportionately on gray infrastructure because of previous challenges around securing sustainable long-term financing for conservation and for marine protected areas. Now, as someone working in the ocean finance space, I'm thrilled to see the breadth of emerging instruments that aim to make conservation more economically viable for countries like my own, because the value proposition here is incredible. Mangrove forests sequester between 4 to 10 times as much carbon as do most terrestrial forests. Restoring and protecting mangroves at a cost of about $100 billion could generate $1 trillion in net benefits by 2030. Intact mangrove ecosystems reduce the costs associated with flooding and storm surges by about $65 billion every single year. So just imagine, once we can appropriately price that resilience value, suddenly investment into that ecosystem can become a real driver of growth in the community. Moreover, protecting that ecosystem, which we already know is aligned with our physical resilience efforts, also becomes an avenue for financial security and for secure livelihoods. One opportunity that's gaining a lot of attention right now is blue carbon, as our resilience credits and biodiversity credits, and yes, a lot more thought has to go into the development of blue carbon, particularly when it comes to lowering transaction costs, standardization, verification, project pipeline, project size. Yes, more work is needed. But that means now is the time to get involved, to ensure that the market truly matures with integrity. And at the Ocean Risk and Resilience Action Alliance, or ORA, we're working together with public and private sector partners to help guide the growth of the blue carbon market. Because with the promise of many of these new products and tools, I begin to see a world where the status quo, say the speculated benefit of turning Shark Creek into a marina, is eclipsed by the economic gains from conservation, by the societal gains from a rich natural environment that has cultural significance, and by the gains to our climate resilience efforts because we chose to keep intact these ecosystems that act as strong natural barriers. And while the example that I've provided today, Great Harbor Key, is deeply personal to me, I want to emphasize that this opportunity I'm talking about, the window of opportunity to design robust economic growth in harmony with our natural environment, still exists, broadly speaking, for all small island developing states. It still exists for all coastal developing countries, and it most certainly still exists for our global community because by virtue of our collective dependence on a healthy planet, we are collectively dependent on a healthy marine environment. All to say that I hope that decades from now, the same joy that I experienced visiting Nana in Great Harbor Key can be experienced by my own grandchildren, knowing that the actions that we collectively took today and continue to take over the course of the year resulted in our community being resilient, intact, and secure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maya. Next, we have Melissa Garvey from the Nature Conservancy.
Ali! Excellencies, friends, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I want to start today by thanking our hosts, the government and the people of Palau, for being so gracious here in our week in Palau. Clearly here, oceans matter, but no matter where we live, oceans make our lives better. They comprise 90% of the habitable space on the planet, provide 50% of the oxygen we breathe, and over 3 billion people depend on marine and coastal biodiversity for their livelihoods. But the world is changing fast, and over the next 4 decades, development pressures will be intense to meet the needs for food and energy and water for 9 billion people on this planet. Coastal areas, which are home to half the world's population, they're under intense threat from climate change. And already nearly 70% of fisheries around the world are either in decline or overfished. And coastal indigenous peoples, who on average are 4 times more dependent on seafood per capita than the global average, are facing these risks head on. At the same time, we're seeing that less than 8% of our oceans are currently protected. We, all of us, have a big challenge ahead to reach the global goal of 30% protection of our oceans. And what we found is that the single largest barrier to ocean protection, it's not will, it's funding. We know that island and coastal countries, many of you here are representing, these are the areas that are at the front lines of climate threat, and we know that these countries want to protect their marine resources, but financing is often what holds them back. But there's hope. The Nature Conservancy's Blue Bond strategy is one solution. We work at the scale of the problem to help governments unlock funds to deliver on their ocean conservation goals and ultimately to support the well-being of their communities. The idea behind our strategy is quite simple. We transform debt into conservation action. And at the heart of all of our Blue Bonds projects is a basic deal. A coastal nation commits to protecting 30% of its ocean using a stakeholder-driven marine spatial planning process. And in support of that, the Nature Conservancy either issues new debt or restructures existing sovereign debt. And that leads to both lower interest rates and much longer repayment periods. The government is then able to use those savings to capitalize a conservation trust fund and support the new marine protected areas to which the country has committed. Importantly, we know that it works. We tested this approach in Seychelles in 2016, where TNC restructured $20 million in national debt. By 2020, Seychelles designated new protected areas that increase protection of their ocean territory from 1% to a full 30%. Now, that's an area larger than Germany. And in November 2021, we conducted the world's largest debt restructuring for oceans. So in support of commitments to protect 30% of its ocean using a participatory marine spatial planning process, TNC restructured $550 million of Belize's debt and generated $180 million in support of marine conservation over the next 20 years. Now, Belize was a very good candidate for a Blue Bonds project. Why? Well, it has high ecological and conservation value. It's the site of the largest barrier reef in the Western Hemisphere and home to extensive mangrove cover. Likewise, Belize's economy is tied to nature. Tourism, and primarily nature-based tourism, constitutes 40% of its GDP. Then COVID-19 and the financial crisis struck Belize particularly hard, and I'm sure many of you experienced this as well in your own home countries. Belize's debt was more than 25% of its GDP by 2021. The Belize Blue Bond that we worked on unlocked $180 million, developed a conservation trust fund, and now a marine spatial plan is underway to design the new protected areas. A full pipeline of Blue Bonds projects is underway across the world. We analyze the changing conservation, political, and financial enabling conditions of all island and coastal countries. Because globally, this strategy will create durable results at scale. We estimate that we can protect 4 million square kilometers of ocean and drive $1.6 billion into sustainable finance for oceans. But we need to get the numbers right to ensure effectiveness and equity. So we've created a costing and benefits framework for more than 65 countries that models the costs of marine protection. We're looking at establishment costs, management, as well as foregone fisheries revenue from MPAs. But we're also looking at the long-term benefits. The idea is that if we know today's costs and tomorrow's benefits, the governments that we partner with can choose the financial mechanisms to help bridge into that sustainable future. The next step, however, is to understand how these costs and benefits, how they're shared among different demographics so that governments can craft policies to smooth out the inequities and ensure that indigenous peoples and local communities benefit. In closing, the stakes have never been higher for our oceans, but with science expertise, financial innovation, and the right partners, we, all of us, we're building a better future for our ocean and the billions of us all who rely on them every day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Next, we have Minister Victor from the Republic of Palau. Please.
Palauan people and culture are inseparable from the ocean around us. Area-based management has been practiced in Palau for millennia. The goal of such efforts ring true today as it did then. MPAs were designed and managed to ensure benefits to people and the ocean. We should be remiss as people if we do not periodically pause to ponder, capture, and more importantly, share lessons that have emerged from this long history of ocean stewardship. On Palau's coastal areas, where benefits to communities are more direct, we have achieved 30% full protection through the Palau Protected Areas Network, and with over 50% of our coastal areas under some form of national and local management regime. This local network of MPAs recognizes and empowers local communities in MPA development, facilitates cross-site learning, and establish a sustainable funding mechanism to ensure long-term management. This funding mechanism relies on tourism, which took a hit during the COVID-19 pandemic. But the Palau Protected Areas Network remains durable almost 20 years because we have adaptively adjusted our management approach. The Palau National Marine Sanctuary has achieved protection of 80% of our exclusive economic zone, an area that has historically been fished by foreign fishing fleets and provided revenue estimated at 3% of our GDP. This protection resulted in direct fisheries loss to the government and indirect loss to our economy. And signs are emerging that reduction in supply of pelagic fish to our local market is shifting pressure back to a vulnerable reef fishery. We need to be adaptive in our management of the Palau National Marine Sanctuary that is guided by good science and inclusive stakeholder engagement to ensure its durability. I believe these challenges of managing large-scale marine protected area within the context of rapid global change is not unique to Palau and perhaps shared by other SEATS countries. As collective global community, we ought to ask ourselves these questions as we accelerate our progress toward 30 by 30. What are the real opportunities for long-term financing for large-scale protected areas, especially for small, large ocean states? How can we better balance durable objectives of protecting biodiversity and optimizing benefits for people in our small recovering communities? We will be able to leverage robust science to inform meaningful and inclusive stakeholder dialogue. How will we evolve as climate change tends to redistribute valuable resources across oceanscapes? Is closing large part of our exclusive economic zones that provide for a nation durable? Ocean leadership is a shared leadership. Many of the problems we face today on our oceans are not created by small coastal communities. Yet, time and time again, we have taken leadership on climate change, and we're now taking leadership on ocean protection. We must ask those who contribute to the most to the problems affecting our ocean to take bold leadership and actions within their national jurisdictions while also leading on global efforts to protect our ocean. And in closing, I'd like to recall what Honorable Kerry said yesterday, that the right path is not necessarily the path of least resistance. We must be willing to engage, recognize, and reposition and navigate tensions and opportunities. Only then can we move from tension to transformation. I believe that the lessons that we are learning and experiencing in Palau are valuable lessons that help accelerate regional achievement of 30 by 30 that ensures our actions provide for durable protection of nature and above all, benefits to our people. I thank you.
Thank you, Minister Victor. Next we have Chairwoman Violet Sagewater. Thank you.
Ali, Haku, hello. I'd like to thank all of our distinguished guests and the people of Palau for hosting this conference. It's been a life-changing experience for me. As the nominator for the proposed Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary, I come to Palau and I find an extended family. If you see the picture on our screen, we call this place Homqua. This is Point Conception. This is the place that we send our ancestors to the next life. This is a place that we send our prayers across the ocean. This is the East-West Bridge, better known as Vandenberg Air Force Base. This will be in the middle of the proposed Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary. This is the place that we send our people to paradise, Sumalikwash. We've been sending prayers of love and gratitude across the Pacific Ocean for the last 20,000 years. And I got onto a plane and spent 30 hours in the air and arrived here in Palau, and I realized we were right, this is paradise. This is definitely paradise on earth. And I found that the people here, the brief time that I get to spend with them, share very similar values, very similar stories, and very similar dire circumstances with regards to the ocean and climate change and the health of our planet. It is our teaching, the Chumash people believe that if you stand in the ocean and say your prayers, that they will be sent around the world. That if you pray into the water, that your prayers will be heard and sent to everyone, that we are one world, that we are all connected, that all life on the planet is interconnected, and that we have an obligation to take care of the places that we live. Our stories are shared experiences. One thing that we have in common is the pressures put on indigenous populations by outside forces that we did not create. The pressures of industrialization, of pollution, of climate crisis were put on indigenous communities and island communities, and we were not the culprits of. But yet we are tasked to participate and to lead in conservation and to advise, but not to reap the rewards of our expertise. Put simply, we need to explore more ways that indigenous communities can be made whole again through work in conservation. This means tangible benefits for local communities. It looks like indigenous people in the blue economy. It's building resilience into local communities to continue addressing the most critical emergencies of our time: food and resource management, extreme weather and fire, health and housing. The boom and bust of clean energy projects is not equitable. In my own experience, the loss that communities face needs to be replaced with more important opportunities that tribal people can be in stewardship roles, co-management of the oceans and land, and they are vital to adopt the rights of indigenous people, to allow for different people, different levels of recognition, all types of indigenous people, to have site-specific management plans in their marine protected areas. This allows for flexibility and crossover between local, state, and federal agencies to hire, to employ, and to create co-management opportunities with indigenous communities who face daily challenges on the ground, living and working. This also allows local opportunity to mitigate losses to specific resources like fishing or access to traditional foods by offering jobs in other areas like resources management and law enforcement, protecting our vital ecosystems. Flexibility built into conservation plans allows for human dignity. At the grassroots level, the management of marine protected areas by indigenous communities who have been tasked for doing the work for free for too long and sidelined to advisory councils instead of valued employees needs to change. We've been asked to stand here and we've been asked to sing songs, which I love to do, but it's also just as important that we're asked to vote, that we're asked to have meaningful participation. The Native people know what conservation means. The Native people know that conservation is a luxury that can only be afforded after our families are fed and provided for in our basic essentials. Putting the burden of the climate crisis on Indigenous communities who are the most underfunded and under-resourced and vulnerable to climate crisis is not equitable. My father and I put hundreds of thousands of hours, volunteer hours, into the nomination for the Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary. When NOAA announced the efforts to open up the new nomination back in 2014, we were thrilled. And we were told this was a grassroots movement. That means that it was unfunded. Like many of my colleagues up here today, which we didn't prearrange, my point is that ocean conservation in the United States is at about 20 cents per acre for ocean conservation versus nearly $30 per acre for land conservation. It's not equitable, and it needs to change. Conservation efforts cannot merely rely on the use of private source fundings to fill budget gaps. I feel like I have to go. I have to wrap this up, but I wanted to say one more thing, and that is the last thing that my father said to me was how proud of the work that we were doing and how important it was to him. The nomination designation phase for the Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary was announced 40 days after he passed. And I would like to share to you his last words about the sanctuary.
For us, the ocean is the lifeblood of our planet. It's the blood that flows in everyone's veins. It is the blood that connects all races and all peoples and all nations. So it is the ultimate life force on the planet Earth for us.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman. Our last panelist, Dwayne Fraser.
Thank you. Good morning. As my esteemed moderator mentioned, my name's Dwayne Fraser. I'm a member of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority Board in Australia, and I chair the advisory committee to the Federal Minister for the Environment. But first and foremost, I'm a native. I'm a Waggarookaba and Bidjara man from Queensland, a traditional owner of the Great Barrier Reef. And I'd like to begin by firstly thanking the Palauan people for having us here on their beautiful island. I pay my respects to their ancestors who've allowed me to walk safely on their land these past few days. I pay homage to your chieftains, your queen, and your community elders for so gracefully welcoming us as they did on Tuesday and Wednesday. I also want to acknowledge your future, the young people who are in this room and across Palau who are working actively in the development of marine parks and terrestrial parks in this place, carrying your knowledge to the next generations. The Great Barrier Reef, of course, is a very large marine park. It's some 350,000 kilometres squared, has about 70 traditional owner groups, all with intrinsic relationships with their land and sea places. The Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, of course, over the last 10 years has been working actively to develop further relationships with those traditional owner groups. And one mechanism of which we do that is through marine park management activities like compliance programs, traditional use of marine resource agreements, heritage protection. And I'm just going to touch on a few of them, and I notice that we only have 5 minutes to do so, so I'll try and get through as much as I can. The marine park is a complex ecosystem with multi-layers of zoning. 2,500 kilometres long coastline, so therefore it comes with a lot of management activities that are quite complex, balancing the use of tourism, fisheries, shipping, etc. It's quite a complex space. One mechanism in which we do this is to undergo a negotiation with traditional owners to establish traditional use of marine resource agreements. A TUMRA is where traditional owners make a decision internally around the way in which they want to manage their own sea space, with a specific focus on dugongs and turtles. The basis of that relationship is to ensure that traditional owner voices are enshrined at the most senior level of our decision making, in particular contribute to the cornerstone policies that we use inside the World Heritage Area. For example, the Reef 2050 Long-Term Sustainability Plan is the principal document in which the Australian and Queensland governments plan to protect the reef right up to 2050 and beyond. Internally, we have a document called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Heritage Strategy, which quite frankly sets out a pathway for the co-management of the reef. Co-management, which of course is an aspiration for most Indigenous peoples in the developed world. Essentially, the Australian government recognises that the long relationship between traditional owners and their country, knowledge that's been developed over 6,000 generations, some 65,000 years, well before the reef was a reality. The reef is only some 7,000 years. We lived and occupied that land before the waters rose and the reef developed. So it creates a pathway for research partnerships, for the investment in the capacity of traditional owner groups to undertake their own monitoring activity. And we're quite proudly in partnership with many of our research partners. This week, the Australian Institute of Marine Science launched the Reef Cloud initiative here in Palau, a sweep of artificial intelligence that will enable Indigenous communities all over the world to monitor their own reefs and to take some 30,000 images can be processed in a matter of minutes to give them a real understanding about the impact of climate change on their oceans and marine parks. The other level of relationship between the Marine Park Authority and our traditional owners is in compliance and incident management. Because of the sheer size of the reef and understanding that the majority of the Australian population in Queensland is the southern east coast, remote parts of the reef are just not manageable from a Commonwealth agency's perspective. So we have to invest in those that live in those places, those who have understanding and relationship to that place and have embedded responsibility as traditional owners. So we train them, we provide them with the accreditation, and then we bequeath powers from the state so that to empower traditional owners on their own country to become Commonwealth inspectors. An Indigenous ranger in northern Queensland can board your vessel, inspect your bag, and fine you and prosecute you should you be breaching the Marine Park Act. And of course, in the sweep of all these activities, what we require is advice from community. Government agencies can't make decisions anymore without the voices of Indigenous people. We acknowledge that, so we embed in our advisory structures the voice of those communities. And here we have a picture of the Marine Park Authority's Indigenous Advisory Committee, a sweep of both young, old, male, female elders and leaders from right across the reef. It's, in my opinion, the most effective way for the authority to get its advice. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, mate.
First, I'd like to again thank the whole panel for your engaging discussions and presentation so far. And as the other panels, we'll start getting into just a quick Q&A. So the first question is from Maya. You mentioned that Aura is working with public and private partnerships to get the blue carbon market going, right? Can you tell us a little bit more about what that looks like?
Sure. So at the Ocean Risk and Resilience Action Alliance, Aura, we're aiming to drive investment into coastal natural capital and to build the resilience of climate vulnerable coastal persons. And we do that through finance and insurance products. And our efforts to help guide the growth of the blue carbon market falls under our proposed Sea Change Impact Finance Facility, or the SCIF for short. And we're developing this in response to what we've heard from market research that we did, which is that a lot of tremendous work is happening in the ocean finance space. Perhaps a bit more cohesion is needed. And so we're building this catalytic entity to drive $1 billion into the space. And we hope to do this by highlighting investable projects, by attracting new sources of capital, and also de-risking investments, thereby hopefully increasing efficiency, increasing the flow of funds, and also strengthening the pipeline of projects. One component of that is the Blue Resilience Clearinghouse, which would be a marketplace that, of course, has guardrails to help facilitate the transaction of high-quality blue resilience projects, which could include blue carbon. And this really is incredibly important because when we think of the areas that are receiving the highest amount of investment in the ocean finance space, so fisheries, aquaculture, that depends on an intact ecosystem. So this is the very foundation of all of the opportunities in the blue economy space. So that's why we think this is incredibly important. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And kind of going further in, or tangential to that piece, and more about, Melissa, what you're talking about, the blue bonds, a couple of questions, or maybe a compound question, which is, what makes a place a good candidate for those blue bonds, and also how can that impact the local communities?
Sure. Let me just be really quick and say that the criteria for working on blue bonds projects, we look really in 3 particular areas, and we're assessing these criteria across all island and coastal countries because it changes. But we're always looking at what's the conservation value in any particular place. What are the political enabling conditions? And then we look to see, is there a financial mechanism that can be used to help secure resources for marine conservation? So we really look across all those areas. And the financial mechanisms that we've used, certainly in Seychelles and in Belize, we were restructuring, at least in Belize in particular, commercial debt. And so the extent to which there's high debt to GDP ratios and high levels of commercial debt that may be in distress, that's a really good financial enabling condition. However, we're also addressing the fact that not all countries fit that profile, and that's not a bad thing. And there may be opportunities to think more creatively about whether it's new debt issuance or combinations of debt restructuring and new debt issuance that can be used so that we can find the right mechanisms that work in the right place to secure the right ocean conservation. But I think what's essential is also how that conservation can be benefiting communities. I think there's been a false construct that large-scale ocean finance and community benefits somehow are not consistent with each other. And that couldn't be further from the truth, and it shouldn't be further from the truth. So what we've embedded in all of our projects is a requirement to use marine spatial planning processes that are stakeholder-driven, that are transparent, and where we're bringing community voices into the design of protected areas. And we know that's important for many reasons, right? It's the communities and the people who live in these areas and who are using these resources who have a lot of the data that's important. And they're also the ones who are going to be important from a long-term compliance and enforcement standpoint as well. So their input matters. The other side of the transaction, though, is where do the resources go once they've been generated? And the way that independent conservation trust funds, or conservation funds as they're sometimes called, are set up are that we're ensuring that those resources are going to projects that are, yes, potentially directly to government to help with the establishment and management, but there's also resources that go to communities to help them with the specific needs that they have that interrelate with the ocean conservation, because that's just so important. And the last thing I'd say is the costing and benefits framework that we've developed. One of the key items that we're really trying to keep a close eye on is how are any of the costs and benefits shared? Because if we don't know the answers to that, we might be missing some opportunities to really be fully involving communities and benefiting them and helping governments to be able to come up with policies that ensure that's the case.
Thank you so much. And kind of, I guess, going further into, we have the financing insured, but going, when you have the local communities that are benefiting, Minister Victor, how can we ensure that we, I guess, the challenges that are coming from that management, the local input and the financing options are all going towards a strategic management plan for the coastal protected areas, and how does if you kind of give some hint on how that differs between the coastal areas versus the further ocean areas?
So I think the need to really value the science that drives how we need to be designing management. We look at coastal protected areas versus large ocean areas and really defining why we're protecting. And coastal areas, these are species that are very much associated with the habitat versus an ocean's resource that's highly migratory. So we have to ask ourselves, are we using the right management approach to be managing the very species that we want to protect? And because we want to protect because it's delivering for people and nature. And so that is, to me, I think, is an essential aspect of how do we ensure that we use marine spatial planning that then helps us deliver undurable benefits for people and nature, thereby provide and protect, not just protect, and provide even more. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Victor. Chairwoman, you spoke a little bit more about a lot about the burden that the indigenous communities feel to, or are placed on the indigenous communities to be able to sustain and address the climate, or sustain the solutions to address the climate crisis. What steps do you think we can take to make sure indigenous conservation efforts are more effective, equitable, and really to add the value to our collective efforts?
That's a great question, and we have been talking about that throughout the whole conference. And I think that being here in Palau is a really great example of how indigenous people add value to conservation. And in my few days here, I've spent time getting to know the local people and talking to them and hearing their stories. And my elders always say that people will not protect things that they don't love. And the indigenous people, especially the captains of the boat who have been captains since before I was born, and the divers who are native and who share songs and stories and histories and language, and that kind of exchange between sanctuaries, marine protected areas, between people and communities, trickles down into the funding, because the funding goes to where people feel is the most important. And the sanctuary here in Palau is probably the most beautiful place I've ever dove in the world. I haven't been to the Great Barrier Reef yet, but if we are successful in the nomination with the Chumash heritage, I look to other indigenous leaders and other indigenous work in Papahanaumokuakea and the Marianas Trench, and here in Palau, and other places where we can share this information and what has successes, and so that we can better use the funding that's available and things that have worked for indigenous people, such as working in science and research and law enforcement and all these areas that add value to every marine protected area and benefit the community at the same time. And so I think that the trend towards marine protection has to include and lift up indigenous people at the same time, because that is the magic that we have with traditional ecological knowledge, as one of the panelists said yesterday, is the stories, the histories, the 10,000, 20,000 year connection with how to properly manage our resources.
Thank you very much. I think that is a very strong message to make sure that it is well known and established that indigenous communities' traditional ecological knowledge adds value to the management, right? And that goes well into the last panelist, Dwayne. You spoke about the importance of traditional ecological knowledge. Can you go over just some of the biggest challenges there are to implementing that?
Sure. I mean, the first thing we need to acknowledge is there's no conservation without Indigenous peoples and local communities. We go to a restaurant and we ask the waiter what's good on the menu, yet we go to communities that have, and we don't ask the locals what's the best way to manage the landscape. It's bizarre. My colleague and the Australian Sherpa for the high-level panel on oceans, Russell Reichart, talks about the measure of knowledge and relationship to place really well, and he was describing it to me the other day, and it's the first time I've learned anything from Russell. I'm only joking, he's a great man. If you took every year as a millimetre, Indigenous knowledge would be 60 metres long. If you take non-Indigenous occupation of Australia, it's about a foot. they're a long way off the end of the journey, right? There's a lot of steps to be taken, and rightfully so. Indigenous communities, Aboriginal people in Australia, Torres Strait Islanders have had sustained and continued relationships with the place that they're from, and they've developed knowledge systems. Western science, Indigenous science. Aboriginal people are the first scientists of the world, in my opinion. We've been practicing, monitoring, protecting, interfering, intervening. We've been doing all of them, all the catchphrases that are now becoming a reality in the language and the dialogue around conservation. There are many ways that you can use traditional knowledge in the management of marine parks, but the core principle is if we talk about data-poor communities, Indigenous communities are the most data-rich for observations, stories, and cultural practices, dancing. Every Aboriginal dance has a relationship to a species or a place. Well, there's a lot to learn. We acknowledge that, and we invest time in developing kind of pathways or opportunities for shared learning between our research institutes and traditional owners. And as a management agency, as a regulator of the marine park, we adapt traditional knowledge in all of our activities in our operation.
Thank you so much. I really love that like kind of what the panelists or what the moderator yesterday, Aulani, mentioned, talking about places that are traditionally seen as data poor. However, when you consider the millennia of passed down knowledge through Indigenous knowledge, that they really are data rich. And each of those songs, traditions is the collection of many, many data points over many centuries and millennia. So thank you. I wish we could spend a lot more time talking about marine protected areas, but I just want to say thank you so much to all the panelists for your presentations and your points of view. Mahalo nui loa.